Samantha's perfect life shattered the moment she betrayed her husband Mark with his best friend Chris. What began as a secret affair spiraled into a deadly chain of events, leading to Chris's devastating HIV diagnosis and a life-altering betrayal. As Mark's world slowly unraveled, so did Samantha's, and the consequences of her actions soon turned deadly. Would she survive the destruction she had caused? Or would everything she held dear be lost forever? Samantha and Mark had always been the couple that others envied. They had met in college, quickly fallen in love, and built a life together that seemed unbreakable. Their suburban home was a testament to their success, well-kept, spacious, and filled with memories of their years of hard work and shared joy. Their friends admired them, and their family often spoke of them as the perfect example of what a marriage should look like. Mark, a successful lawyer, was the type of man everyone respected, and Samantha, a charming and accomplished woman, had a reputation for being the perfect wife. To the outside world, they had it all. But behind the closed doors of their home, the perfection was beginning to crack. As the years passed, the excitement of their early days together slowly faded. The passion that once defined their relationship was replaced with routine. Conversations became shorter, the spark between them dimmed, and the distance between them grew. Their marriage, once filled with shared laughter and late-night talks, became quieter and more predictable. Their 2 children, now growing older, filled the house with noise, but that noise was no longer the sound of a happy, connected family. It was just the sound of a life moving forward despite the emptiness. Mark was often away on business trips, leaving Samantha with the responsibility of running the house and taking care of their children. She was a loving mother, but her heart longed for something more. The love and attention she craved from Mark were no longer there. It wasn't that he didn't love her. It was just that the demands of his career had pulled him further away from her emotionally. The connection they once had seemed lost in the shuffle of everyday life. Then there was Chris. Chris had been Mark's best friend since childhood, and he often visited their home, staying for dinner or to catch up after a long week of work. Initially, Samantha enjoyed Chris's company. He was charming, funny, and always the life of the party. There was a natural camaraderie between them that felt comforting, something she hadn't realized she was missing. Their conversations became frequent, the banter easy and effortless. What began as simple, friendly chats over coffee soon turned into deeper, more personal discussions. They talked about everything: relationships, dreams, frustrations, and the aching loneliness that Samantha had been feeling for some time. Chris, too, was going through a rough patch in his life. Recently divorced, he seemed to understand Samantha's loneliness in a way no one else did. He had been where she was, feeling abandoned and isolated in a relationship. They shared their vulnerabilities, their fears, and the sadness that often consumed them. He made her laugh in ways Mark hadn't in years, and soon, he became a constant presence in her life. It wasn't long before the lines between friendship and something more began to blur. Samantha found herself drawn to Chris in a way that was impossible to ignore. There was something in the way he looked at her, the way he listened, the way he made her feel seen and appreciated. It wasn't intentional, but a spark was lit. They spent more time together, talking late into the night, sharing moments of laughter and eventually quiet moments of longing. A kiss, unexpected yet undeniable, changed everything. Samantha's heart raced, and for the first time in years, she felt alive again. What started as a harmless friendship had now become something far more dangerous, an affair that would shatter everything. Samantha's mind was flooded with guilt, but the thrill of the secret, the excitement of someone new, drowned out her better judgment. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. She was desperate for affection, for connection, for something that felt real. Chris offered that in ways Mark no longer could. Their affair became an escape from the loneliness that had consumed her for so long, a momentary high that filled the void in her heart. What Samantha didn't realize, though, was that the choices she was making would soon spiral out of control and set off a chain of events that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The affair between Samantha and Chris quickly escalated, and the thrill of their secret became all-consuming. At first, the guilt gnawed at her, but over time it faded into the background, overshadowed by the intense feelings she had for Chris. Every stolen moment, every hidden glance made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The passion she had longed for was now in her reach, and it was intoxicating. She no longer felt invisible or unnoticed. Chris saw her, really saw her, in a way Mark hadn't in years. Their stolen rendezvous became more frequent, more daring. Each time they met, Samantha found herself sinking deeper into a web of deceit. But she told herself that she deserved this attention, this connection. Samantha's marriage with Mark continued to deteriorate as she grew more distant, more closed off. She no longer tried to rekindle the love that had once defined their relationship. Mark, completely unaware of the affair, sensed a shift in Samantha's behavior. He tried to reach out, to find a way back to the connection they once had. But Samantha's mind was elsewhere. Every night when Mark was at work or out on business trips, she was with Chris. Their time together was stolen and fleeting, but it was enough to make her forget the growing cracks in her marriage. It wasn't long before the reality of their actions began to set in. Samantha's growing sense of shame was balanced by a disturbing sense of power. She had control over something she hadn't had in years. Chris, who had once been Mark's best friend, now held a piece of her heart that belonged to someone else. But it wasn't just the affair that had changed her life. Something else began to change within her. Samantha had always been careful, cautious about her health. She had trusted her marriage, trusted Mark, to protect her from the risks of infidelity. But in the excitement of her secret life, she ignored one crucial detail: her health. When Chris tested positive for HIV, Samantha's world was turned upside down. The news hit her like a thunderclap, shocking her to her core. She had never imagined that this affair, this temporary escape from the monotony of her life, would lead to such devastating consequences. At first, she didn't want to believe it. She reassured herself that Chris had other risks in his life, that he must have been with someone else who was the source of his diagnosis. But the reality began to settle in. Samantha had infected him. The affair she had treated as an innocent escape had, in fact, resulted in something far more dangerous and irreversible. The fear hit her hard. Could she have passed the virus on to Mark? What about the future? The weight of the situation was too much to carry. Yet she couldn't stop herself from falling deeper into the mess she had created. She avoided Chris, hoping he wouldn't bring up the subject again, but the guilt was suffocating. Chris had already begun to suffer, his health declining rapidly as the virus took hold. He was angry, frustrated, and confused. His life had been turned upside down, and he had no idea how it had happened. Samantha couldn't bring herself to confess the truth to him, to tell him that she was the one responsible. The shame was too great, the consequences too terrifying. As the days went on, Samantha felt trapped in her own lies. She could no longer deny the truth. The affair had cost her more than just her marriage. It had put her health at risk and ruined the lives of everyone involved. But what was done was done. The reality of her actions could not be undone, no matter how much she wished she could take it all back. Samantha's once perfect life had begun to crumble, and the aftermath of her decisions was starting to unfold in ways she could never have predicted. The days following Chris's diagnosis were filled with a quiet, suffocating tension. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had worked so hard to protect, the perfect family, the perfect life, was slipping away. The guilt consumed her, gnawing at her from the inside out. But it wasn't just the affair itself that tormented her. It was the aftermath of that betrayal, the irrevocable consequences of what she had done to Chris and, possibly, Mark. Chris's health continued to decline. He looked worse every time Samantha saw him. His face was drawn, his eyes tired and distant. Samantha could barely meet his gaze anymore, as if his pain was a constant reminder of her own guilt. She had never meant for this to happen. She had never imagined that her actions, her desperation for a connection, would lead to something so destructive. But as much as she tried to distance herself from the situation, the reality was impossible to ignore. She had caused this. She had infected him, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing. Chris began to ask questions, and his suspicion grew. He was no longer willing to accept vague reassurances. Why was his health deteriorating so quickly? Why was no one talking about it openly? He pushed harder, determined to find answers. Samantha could see the anger building within him, but she wasn't ready to face the truth. She kept up the facade, pretending everything was normal when, in reality, it felt like the ground beneath her was cracking open. One evening, after a tense conversation between them, Chris made a bold move. He confronted Samantha, demanding to know the truth. She froze, her heart racing as she realized that there was no way to deny the inevitable any longer. The affair, the disease, everything was about to come out. The truth she had buried so deeply was finally rising to the surface, and there was no turning back. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to control her emotions, but the shame overwhelmed her. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper as she admitted what she had done. She had infected him. She had betrayed both her husband and her best friend in the most unforgivable way. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air between them. Chris was speechless, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. He couldn't understand how someone he had trusted, someone who had been like a sister to him, could do something so heartless. The betrayal, now out in the open, was a brutal blow. Chris's anger was palpable. He demanded to know why she hadn't told him sooner. Why had she kept this secret from him, allowing him to suffer in silence while she lived her life as if nothing had changed? Samantha had no answer. There was nothing she could say to undo what had been done, to make it right. She had been too scared, too consumed by her own self-preservation, to confront the consequences of her actions. And now, it was too late. The confrontation left both of them reeling. Samantha knew she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Chris, once her friend, now looked at her with a deep visceral resentment. The bond between them, once so strong, was shattered beyond repair. But that wasn't the worst of it. The truth of the affair, the disease, the pain, all of it was starting to seep into every aspect of Samantha's life. Mark had always trusted her, and now she knew that her secret could no longer be kept. The walls she had so carefully built around her life were beginning to crumble, and the fallout from her betrayal was only just beginning. As the weight of her actions continued to press down on her, Samantha found herself at a crossroads. The perfect life she had worked so hard to build was unraveling in front of her, and she had no idea how to stop it. All she could do now was brace for the inevitable storm that was coming, and wonder how much longer she could keep up the facade before it all came crashing down. The aftermath of the confrontation between Samantha and Chris left her in a whirlwind of chaos. Samantha had always been able to control the narrative of her life, to keep things in perfect order. But now, everything felt out of her control. She had spent years building a life based on lies, and now those lies were threatening to consume her. Chris was no longer the friendly confidant he once was. His anger burned through every word he spoke, and Samantha could see the depth of his hurt, the pain in his eyes that reflected back at her the depth of her betrayal. As Chris's health continued to deteriorate, Samantha's guilt intensified. His condition worsened with each passing day, and she couldn't escape the reality of what she had done. He was sick, and she was the one who had made him so. The weight of the responsibility felt crushing, but there was no way to undo what had been done. Samantha had watched him spiral, and now her life too was spiraling out of control. The relationship that had once felt like a lifeline now felt like a deadly trap, and she was the one who had set it. Chris was no longer a part of her life in any real sense. He had cut her off completely after their confrontation. No more late-night talks, no more brief meetings in the quiet corners of their world. The bond that once seemed unbreakable was gone, replaced by the icy silence of a broken friendship. Samantha's world was filled with a hollow emptiness, her home now colder than it had ever been. Mark was oblivious, still consumed by his work, still trying to reignite the spark he felt was missing in their marriage. But Samantha could no longer pretend. She could no longer wear the mask of the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect friend. The cracks were too wide and the guilt was too deep. Days turned into weeks, and still, Samantha couldn't bring herself to confess everything to Mark. She couldn't bring herself to tell him that she had not only betrayed him, but had put both their lives in danger. Her silence was suffocating, but the thought of facing Mark's reaction, the devastation, the disbelief, the anger was unbearable. How could she possibly explain the unexplainable? How could she look him in the eyes and tell him the truth about what had happened, what she had done? Meanwhile, Chris's condition continued to deteriorate. It was clear that he was not going to survive much longer. Samantha tried to distance herself, tried to pretend that everything was fine. But deep down, she knew the truth. Chris would die, and she would be the one to blame. He had every right to be angry, every right to seek justice for the pain she had caused him. But her own sense of self-preservation kept her silent, kept her from acknowledging the depth of the consequences she faced. Her marriage, too, was slowly crumbling. Mark began to sense that something was off. He didn't know the full truth, but he could feel the distance between them. He had always known that something was wrong, but he hadn't yet connected the dots. The strain between them was becoming more visible every day, and he had begun questioning everything. The small signs were there. Samantha's sudden moods, her avoidance of certain conversations, her growing detachment. Mark was no fool. He could see the changes even if he couldn't understand them. One evening, after another failed attempt to bridge the gap between them, Samantha found herself sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet, the weight of her choices heavy on her shoulders. She had built this life from the ground up, and now it was slipping through her fingers. The perfect family, the perfect marriage, everything she had tried to protect was now in shambles. The secrets, the lies, the affair. It all came crashing down on her. And as she sat there staring at the walls of the home she had once believed would be her sanctuary, she realized that there was no escaping the truth any longer. No matter how hard she tried to keep the pieces of her life together, they were falling apart, one lie at a time. The world around her seemed to be closing in, and the storm she had so desperately avoided was finally at her doorstep. The consequences of her actions were no longer a distant possibility. They were here, and they were unstoppable. Samantha had no idea how much longer she could keep running from the truth, but one thing was certain. The life she had once known was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. The tension that had been building in Samantha's life for months finally reached its breaking point. She could no longer keep up the facade. Her marriage to Mark was hanging by a thread. Chris's health was deteriorating rapidly, and she was suffocating under the weight of her own guilt. The cracks in her perfect life had grown too wide, and there was no way to ignore them any longer. What had started as a momentary escape, a brief affair that seemed harmless at the time, had turned into a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Chris, once vibrant and full of life, was now barely recognizable. His once muscular frame had withered, and his skin had taken on a sickly pallor. He had spent weeks in and out of the hospital, battling infections and the slow, inevitable progression of HIV. He was angry, disillusioned, and in a strange, twisted way, his pain mirrored Samantha's own. They had once shared a friendship, but now it was a bond shattered by betrayal. Chris had been her confidant, her companion in the dark hours of her marriage, but now he was a reminder of everything she had destroyed. Samantha had been trying to avoid him, too terrified to face the reality of her actions. But when she received a call late one evening, she knew it was time. Chris had taken a turn for the worse, and he wanted to see her. It was as if he had reached the end of his rope, and he needed the truth to set him free, even if it meant tearing apart the last shred of their connection. The moment Samantha walked into his hospital room, she felt as though the walls were closing in on her. Chris's eyes, once full of warmth and friendship, were now filled with a quiet fury. The anger wasn't just at the disease that was consuming him, but at her. The woman he had trusted, the woman who had been his closest friend, and the woman who had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. He no longer cared for the reasons or excuses she might offer. The truth had already been revealed, and now there was no going back. She tried to speak, to apologize, but the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the destruction she had caused. Chris didn't want her apologies, he wanted justice. He wanted retribution for what she had done to him, for the betrayal that had taken away his future, his health, his life. Samantha's heart sank as she realized just how much she had lost. What had once been a simple affair, a brief escape, had now become the source of her unraveling. Later that evening, when Samantha returned home, Mark confronted her. It was clear that he had been piecing together the clues. The long hours spent at the hospital, the distance between them, the sudden changes in her behavior. He no longer believed the excuses she had fed him. Mark had always been perceptive, and now the questions he had been too afraid to ask were pouring out of him. Samantha stood before him, the weight of everything she had hidden hanging heavily between them. The moment she had been dreading had arrived, and there was no avoiding it. Tears filled her eyes as she finally told him everything. The affair, the HIV diagnosis, the guilt she had carried alone. Mark's reaction was a mixture of disbelief, heartbreak, and anger. He couldn't comprehend how everything had fallen apart so quickly, how the woman he had loved and trusted had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. The pain on his face mirrored the agony in her heart, but there was no way to undo the damage. No amount of apologies could bring back the trust they had lost. No amount of regret could heal the wounds that had been inflicted. The police arrived soon after, called by an anonymous tip about Chris's deteriorating condition. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Chris's anger had turned into something darker. It wasn't just his health he wanted revenge for. It was the life he had once shared with Mark, now irrevocably torn apart. His rage had driven him to dangerous lengths, and the investigation soon shifted from betrayal to murder. The revelation of Chris's intentions shocked everyone. In his final days, consumed by his illness and his anger, he had sought to destroy the people who had destroyed him. Samantha's betrayal had not only torn apart her marriage, but had set in motion a tragic series of events that no one could have predicted. Chris had made it his mission to bring Mark to the same place of pain he had found himself in. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Samantha was left standing in the ruins of everything she had built. Her marriage was gone. Her friendship with Chris was shattered. And the life she had once known was a distant memory. She had lost everything, all for a fleeting moment of passion, a moment that had cost her everything. The consequences of her actions were irreversible, and the damage was done. What she had once believed was a secret affair had turned into a catastrophic tragedy, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life.